Morning, class. Today I want to just do a quick mini lecture on the three poems, or the four poems actually, that I had you guys do for the discussion boards 1 and 2. Keep in mind, I'm not looking for right or wrong answers here. I'm looking at how well you support those answers, especially when you use kind of the suggestions I gave in the kind of how to go about reading poetry and responding to poetry mini lecture I posted a while ago. So I'm just going to kind of go through these and hit some of the highlights. And so this shouldn't be a very long video. So we'll start with Those Winter Sundays, I think. Oh. There we go. I think. Take a second for it to come up. All right. So I think most of you got the idea that this was somebody who's an adult looking back on his childhood and thinking about his father. And it's very descriptive, a lot of imagery. And one of the things that I think is kind of important to pay attention to is this line here, the very first line, where it says, Sundays too, my father got up early. Key word being too. So you get the idea that this guy, even on his day off, got up and in the cold mornings with his cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather. So we know this is a hardworking man. And even on Sundays, he got up early, got the fires going, got things ready for the day. And then here it says, no one ever thanked him. All right, which is also important. So if you kind of take this first line and this one, these are kind of important lines. So the speaker's talking about, I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, feeling the chronic angers of that house. Now, maybe a lot of people might think that this has something to do with the dad, and it might, you know, he might be kind of a cranky guy. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love his family. That doesn't mean he abuses his family or anything like that. Or it could just be the house they live in is, you know, not the greatest. And, you know, when you think about you have to get up in the morning and get the fire going just to be warm. So there's a couple ways you could kind of look at that, okay? But the other way maybe to think about it is men, especially in the past, and I can even talk about my fathers and grandfathers, showing affection, especially to sons, was kind of not a thing they did. You know, they felt like if their job was to kind of toughen them up and not be very affectionate. I feel very fortunate that I grew up in an age, and had my children in an age where it was far more acceptable for men to show their emotions and show their affection even towards their male sons. So that's kind of a change. So speaking indifferently to him, indifferently, well, like he doesn't care. To him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. So here's another thing. This guy gets up in the morning and on Sunday morning and polishes his kids' shoes. And then he kind of has this lamentation here, this kind of thing, where this kind of almost regretful thing. What did I know? What did I know? And it's always important in a poem to kind of pay attention to when things are repeated. Of love's austere and lonely offices, okay? So austere, there's a nice definition of it, sober, grave, lacking adornment, and lonely offices. And offices just here means kind of places. So I get the idea here that here's this guy with his own kids now, looking back on his father and going, and kind of baffled by why his kids aren't grateful for all the amazing things he does for them. Where in fact, that's probably just normal. As a matter of fact, it's exactly what he did when he was a kid. So this is just kind of this, you know, it's not a big deal poem, but it's kind of beautiful in the sense that, you know, we all get to a certain age and You know, we kind of realize, oh, maybe our parents weren't so wrong and so stupid and so mean and so bad. And I have learned too. I don't expect my kids to be grateful. I wish they would be, but of course, that's probably hoping for a little too much. So uh, I think as they get older, hopefully they will be. That's all you can hope. So that's kind of what this poem's all about. Let's go on to the next one here. Let's see. Oh, how do I get back to it? I'm going to pause this for just a second, okay? Okay, so we're back. Now, Emily Dickinson, this is a pretty good poem, one that I like to talk about. So let's do this one. So obviously this poem is about death, but it's got a certain point of view about death. And one of the most interesting things about this poem, and a lot of you kind of mentioned this, is that our speaker is actually a dead person, okay? And it has kind of this attitude about death. And, you know, for human beings, you know, death and love are kind of the two big mysteries of life, right? Okay, so Dickinson is kind of exploring death here. And the overall tone of this is actually fairly positive. She seems rather calm. The language talks about death as being actually kind of kind and gentle. And the big idea is at the end when it talks about immortality and I'll kind of, and what that means, and especially in terms of time. So because I could not stop for death, of course, who does stop for death? And you say, oh, it's time to stop. Here's death. So he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. I had put away my labor and leisure too for his civility. Okay, so she's dead now. All the labor and leisure of life gone, don't matter anymore. And she does it because this death is so civil, kind, gentle. Now, this is kind of an interesting little passage here where it talks about, it's almost like that, you know, people say, well, when you die, you see your whole life flash before your eyes, that kind of thing. So this is kind of a metaphor for time, okay? We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring, okay? Childhood. We passed the fields of gazing grain, which I'll explain that a little bit. So as you know, grain matures, it ripens and stuff. And so she's kind of going through her adulthood. And here we pass the setting sun. Well, it's the sun for us humans is this super major metaphor for all kinds of things, okay? For time, for life, for, you know, just growth. Okay, we pass the setting sun. So the setting sun is old age, okay? And then she says this, or rather, he passed us, okay? So she's still alive. The sun goes to dark, which is symbolic of death, and yet she's still there, and they're riding along in this carriage. So, or rather, he passed us, which, okay, so now we're starting to get this idea that time has taken on a whole new meaning in death. And this is kind of this part here. Many people would say that this is basically her describing her burial gown. This part here, you know, the last house you're going to live in is your coffin, and they go by her grave where her coffin is. She sees that. But then, this stanza here is kind of really important. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, I got to tell you, I'm going to be really honest with you. The idea of eternity just scares the hell out of me. I can't think of what I would do for eternity other than get bored. And if I ended up in heaven, I'd probably get kicked out because I'd be so bored I'd find things to amuse myself. But here's the thing. This is what I kind of like about this poem, is this gives eternity a context. Okay, since then, she's talking about when death picked her up. it's actually been centuries, but when you're dead, it feels shorter than the day. Well, it kind of makes sense. Maybe when we're in eternity, our whole concept of time is out the window. It's something new. So the nice thing about this poem and why I like it is it kind of has this don't excuse me, don't fear death kind of quality to it. Um, I think that's kind of a good idea, an interesting idea. So that's kind of the deal with this poem. Okay, my Papa's Waltz. Okay, so this poem, I might kind of throw a ringer at you with this, but I do want to talk about it. And this is really one of the poems where you really have to think about imagery. So we'll wait for this to come up. All right. So in almost 80% of the time, students kind of go alcoholic, child abusing father. Okay. I would suggest to you, if you really read it closely and really kind of looked at the imagery, especially kind of ask yourself, what are you seeing here? And what kind of language is used, you might see it a lot differently. So I'm going to kind of just walk you through this one, okay? So it starts out, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. Okay, so sure, sounds like the dad might have stopped off and had a few drinks. How many of you or your parents come home and have a beer or two after a hard day's work? That doesn't mean you're a crazy alcoholic child abuser, right? And as a matter of fact, if we ask ourselves, what do we know about this dad? We know a couple things. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt. This guy's a hardworking man. He's out there digging ditches, doing construction, doing something that's really manual labor. I don't know, you're going to begrudge a guy a few drinks or a few beers after work? Now, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. Okay. Well, if somebody was trying to beat the hell out of you, would you hang on to him or would you try to run away? Just ask him. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. All right. So romped isn't necessarily associated with violence. Romp is more associated with play. Matter of fact, they're kind of banging around in there and messing up the kitchen. Now, if the mother was watching this all happen, do you think her response would be more than a frown? Just ask it. So we romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. So really, there's nothing even in this one that suggests any kind of violence. So let's go on to the next stanza. The hand that held my wrist, not grasped, clasped, squeezed, clenched, pick a word. It's just held. Was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. Now, you kind of just close your eyes and imagine this scene. Here's a little boy and his dad and him are kind of pretend dancing and horsing around after a hard day's work. Here's a little boy whose head probably just comes up to his dad's waist. It's not saying my dad took off his belt and beat the hell out of me with a buckle. You can imagine him swinging around and swaying around, and every once in a while the kid's head kind of brushes up against the dad's belt buckle, okay? You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt. It doesn't say you beat my head. It didn't say you smack me. It didn't slap me. Beat time on your head. Well, I tell you what, I've got a son. I've occasionally used his head for a bongo. I'd walk up behind him and do a little pat on the old head, beat time on his head. Nothing to do with violence, just horsing around. Now, this last line, 2 lines. Then waltz me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Again, I want to go back to the beginning. If this boy was being beat up by his father, being abused by his father, do you think that he'd be clinging to the shirt or just trying to get away? Now, a couple things I want to just briefly talk about. One of the things we always have to do with a story or poem is, kind of ask ourselves, are we bringing kind of our own baggage or our kind of own experience to this poem? or do we just need to read the poem for what it is? Now, believe me, every class I teach this every time I teach English 102, and at least half the class goes with the alcoholic child abuse angle. But I would suggest to you that in the year 2020, we are far more aware, and our ideas about this kind of thing are far different, okay? And just to be honest, when I was growing up, a drunken dad, an alcoholic dad, could go home every night of the week and beat the shit out of his family, and nobody would say anything. And we're talking back in the early 60s, well, mid 60s, even into the 70s. We're a lot different now. If we see abuse, we're more likely to report it or intervene in some way, okay? And just because somebody drinks doesn't mean they're an alcoholic, so keep that in mind. And there's nothing really in here that suggests that, other than he came home after a hard day's work, stopped off, had a few drinks, and came home. So that's one thing to really kind of keep in mind, you guys, is we can kind of impose our 2020 sensibilities on a poem that I believe this was written in 1942, which was quite a while ago, when things are a lot different and the way people kind of related to one another is a lot different. So I just kind of like that poem as a way to, kind of illustrate this idea that sometimes, we have our initial impression and then we probably want to back off and reread it and really read it from the perspective of kind of how do you read poetry? Words matter. Words matter big because poems are very short. So a single word can pack a lot of meaning. All right. So I just kind of wanted to go through this one, and then we'll go through The Ruined Maid. By Thomas Hardy. For it to come up. So a little bit about Thomas Hardy before we get this. He was writing really through the Victorian era, the latter part of the 18th century, in the 1800s. I was a contemporary of Charles Dickens, and one of Hardy's kind of big themes is to sort of poke at our sort of ideas about morality, what's moral and immoral, or why are we so fast to judge other people by the choices they make? And a lot of times I like to say that he kind of likes to try to knock us off our moral high horse now and then. And then he's doing it in this poem, okay? So the one thing that is kind of important about this poem is Amelia had been working on a farm, probably as some kind of rented out hand. So keep in mind, back in that time when families were very, very poor and they couldn't even afford to feed their children, they would rent them out to other people. And these jobs were crappy jobs, and they were exploited and not well taken care of, and barely, the only people who were getting a little bit of money were their parents. So, and this was a fairly common thing. Let me give you an example. So if you've seen Mary Poppins, right? And this is kind of that same era in a way. Those chimney sweeper guys look like they're having a really good time and that it's really a cool job and they're pretty happy about it. Well, the fact is during the time when Hardy was writing and Dickens, people would rent out or indenture, whatever you want to call it, small children to the chimney sweepers, because when you think about it, who fits really good down a chimney? Well, a little boy. A lot of little boys either, you think about it, when you put a little boy down a chimney, what could go wrong? Well, a million things, right? Even if it's just that they've been breathing that soot and it affects them later on in life. So we'll maybe look at a poem about that when we do the Blake stuff, because he writes a poem about that. So Amelia gets the hell off of the farm, when you can't blame her, especially she didn't have shoes or socks. Let's see, she could barely talk decent. Her hands were like paws, face blue and bleak. You used to call home life a hag-ridden dream. You'd sigh and you saw. So, look, being on this farm was not really a great deal. So she gets out, she goes to town. This was written in 1860 something, if I'm right. when this girl like this, who's from poverty anyway, shows up in town, how many choices do you think she has? Can she run down to the technical college and get a degree in nursing? No. So she's got to find a way to sort of live a better life. And even if that means prostitution, which amongst her choices may have been her best choice, which there we've got Hardy kind of going after this sort of morality idea. You know, I mean, how can you judge her? I mean, she's better off than she was before. And, you know, and you'll notice there's a very sarcastic tone, especially from Mealy in here, this idea of being ruined. And ruined is really a moral term here. One, she's lost her virginity by being a prostitute. Second, she's a prostitute, okay? So it's really easy for us to, you know, especially in our kind of Judeo-Christian mentality, you know, really judge poor Amelia. But on the other hand, she took control of her life. She's the one in charge of her situation. And maybe amongst the choices she had, this was the best one. She doesn't seem too upset about it. So let's kind of go through the poem real quick. Well, Amelia, my dear, this does everything crown. Who would have supposed I should meet you in town? And whence such fair garments and such prosperity? Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined, says she. So it's this kind of, this is almost kind of a sarcasm, you know. And you'll notice as going through the poem that everything that Amelia says is just going right over this girl's head. So the girl says, you left us in tatters without shoes or socks, tired of digging potatoes and spudding up docks. And now you've gay bracelets and bright feathers 3. Yes, that's how we dress when we're ruined, said she. Again, that kind of sarcasm. At home in the barton, which is another word for farm, you said thee and thou and thickoon and thesoon and t'other, but now you're talking quite fitsy for high company. Some polish is gained with one's ruin, said she. Again, you know, things are actually better for her. Your hands were like paws then, your face blue and bleak, but now I'm bewitched by your delicate cheek, and your little gloves fit as on any lady. They never do work when we're ruined, said she. Well, I guess being a prostitute, if you compare that to working on the farm, really isn't that much work. I mean, you know, I'll be blunt here, you know, people do kind of like to have sex, right? You used to call home life a hag-ridden dream, and you'd sigh and you'd sock, but at present you seem to know not of megrims or melancholy. Megrims or migraines. True, one's pretty lively when ruined, said she. Okay, so this last stanza. I wish I had feathers, a fine sweeping gown, and a delicate face, and could strut about town. My dear, a raw country girl such as you be cannot quite expect that. You ain't ruined, said she. So she's saying probably your only way out is to come here to town and become a prostitute. And this ruined is, you know, a very ironic kind of term in this poem. Okay, everybody else may see her as ruined, but she doesn't see her as ruined. Or she said better. She's seen herself better off than she ever was. So I hope that this kind of helps. And again, you know, you don't have to concern yourself that your answer doesn't match up with kind of the points I've made in this mini lecture. I just kind of feel like it's important to go through it. And then just to let you know, in a regular classroom, I would do the same thing. I would have the students do the discussion boards, submit them, and then I would discuss the poems. So just to be clear, I'm not all that interested in if you're right on the money or right. What I'm interested in is, do you develop your ideas with some, you know, some examples and an explanation about why you think that, or even, you know, how you look at the language, those points that I went over in the previous mini lecture about how to approach poetry. So we about got this semester wrapped up. I'll do one more mini lecture on the last group of poems, and really all you've got to do is the couple little poetry exercises, and I would get started on that final research essay. So we'll get this semester over with.